We ready, Ford? Listen, Ford, go outside and find 10 people you can pay to come in here and fill up the last seats, okay?
Those are the expensive seats.
Charge them $15 in. Listen, thank you all very much for being here today. I want to thank Ford Heacock for the effort he's put in to resurrect the ARCF. I got it right, Ford? I'd also like to recognize my son who is here with us today. Stand up, Charles. Charles was at his first race in 1978 when he was 2.5 years old, and he'd sit up on the pit wall, and when our car would go by, he'd go 9, 9. I'm told to keep counting. Anyway, I was the promoter of the race for 5 years, and my partner was Dave Cowart. Dave and I had race cars together. Come on, Dave, stand up, take a bow. We kind of separated in '78, and David went off to win 2 GTO championships, and I went off to stumble around in 935s. So it was a fun trip for both of us, I think. But and also thank you to the many other folks here today that have put a lot of effort into the Hall of Fame and the ARCF. And we look forward to growing and recognizing and appreciating the history of Sebring in the years to come. And we need more people there, and we need some of the younger folks too. So, can I talk about the promotion real quick, Bill?
Your show. You can do anything you want. In fact, if you'd take the whole hour, it'd make me feel much more comfortable.
Well, I was thinking about that. Anyway, if some of you, I think many of you here remember the days in the mid-'70s when there was always a question as to whether Sebring would occur again. And finally, in spring of '77, after the race here, David and I just finished our second race in Sebring. And Greenwood said he was not coming back. He didn't like anything and blah, 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 blah. The media was just terrible. And when I saw that, I thought, this might be something to go after. I said, you've got a business that has a built-in clientele that is loyal beyond loyalty, and you also have a lot of other people that are. Sorry, I'm getting a little feedback here. A lot of other people that were really supportive of the race. So I called David. I said, you want to become a race promoter? And he's like, are you crazy? Yes. So anyway, we took over the race in '77, and we went through the rigors of recognizing or seeing the racetrack with no clothes, meaning all the racing stuff was gone, all the excitement was gone, and it was just looked like a bombed out village over here. But we put our heads down and decided that we were going to do what was necessary to restore the tradition and the stature of Sebring, which we added our piece to that, and look at Sebring today. It's totally incredible. Anyways. Okay, well, we'll talk about racing later.
I spent the last 2 weeks and most of last night writing up to how I'm going to introduce this fabulous panel you got here, and I figured out that, 3 of them did all the same thing. So I kind of cut that down. But we'll start with my friend Judy Stropus. I first saw Judy back in 1969. You were working here in the little concrete block area where you were scoring the race. Judy is she's a savant when it comes to numbers. She could score every car in a 24-hour race and never leave her stand all night long, all day long. And Judy, you were just marvelous. How did you do that? You wrote the book. I read the book. I still don't understand how you did it.
The key term here is BC, before computers. Keep in mind that many of you are used to seeing all the digitalized, whatever the word is, stuff on the screen. You watch TV, you see all the numbers, you see all these, and we didn't have that back then. I mean, that only came in the 80s. So all these races, 12-hour races, 24-hour races, were scored manually by the officials who had dozens of people and backups. They would write the numbers and they would make a lap chart. But I'm in the pits solo with the top teams usually because they're the only ones that could afford me. And working and doing every lap for every car that was important, not during practice and qualifying, and then the lap chart for the entire race and providing the information to my teams. So that's, and I started, my first race was in 1967, 5-hour race in Marlboro. I can't understand
Marlboro.
Marlboro.
Like the cigarette.
What, Floyd?
Let me ask you a question. You were concentrating so hard, tabulating all the cars. What if somebody came up and wanted to say, "Hi, Judy, how you doing?" Well, how'd you handle that?
That's the funny, no, I ignore everybody. That's the funny story. And it took Bob Varsha of TV fame years and years and years to finally like me, because in the middle of the 24-hour race now, and probably even Sebring, he would come up to me trying to interview me, and I said, I can't talk. Live on TV, and I'm going, and he told me 20 years, 30 years later that story, and he said, "Don't you remember that?" I said, "Of course I don't remember that. How would I remember that?" But he was angry. He was upset with me for all those years.
Your first pro team was Bud Moore, and then went to Roger Penske?
Yes, my first team was Bud Moore, who discovered me. This is a long story. I crashed my Alpha in New York and Long Island and Bridgehampton, and then so I didn't have a car, and I had to go down Marlboro for the under 2-liter race to do a lap chart for my friend, and I took a bus. And if anybody remembers Duke Manor, who wrote for Auto Week, I was friends with him and his girlfriend Charlie. They picked me up, took me to the track. And that night, the cocktail reception with Ford and Lincoln Mercury was the team with the Cougars. And they said, Fran Hernandez of Ford at the time said, we have a 5-hour race the next day, Trans Am. And how do we know because again, the officials only provided you information on a sheet every hour or so. And so they needed to know where they stood. These are the factory teams against the Penske teams. And Duke Manor says, "Well, Judy does that," because I had learned that system from a club in New York, and I was able to modify it to work in the pits for a team. And I said, "Oh yeah, I do that." So they said, "Well, we'll pay you $25." I said, "Okay, great." So I did the lap chart for 5 hours, and I knew it was perfect. I didn't have any real problem with it. So they called and said, "Come on out to the West Coast. You have to be with us." And then the next year, the javelin team wanted my services. I was not the Penske javelin team, but the anyway, Jim Jeffords and Ronnie Kaplan, that team. And in the middle of that, Roger Penske walks by me at some race and says, "Why aren't you working for me?" And I went, "Who was that guy?" Now I knew who it was. And so I ended up working Can-Am for them at the end of that year, and then the next few years with them. And then many teams wanted my services, which included the Dick Barbour team, the Red Lobster team, all those teams that wanted my services. So I worked a system where I could work for all of them. Their invoices per team were small, but I made a lot of money. And
Wait a minute now. You worked for Roger Penske. He locked you up one time, didn't he?
oh, that's a long story.
Well, shorten it. It's pretty good.
4-hour race in Michigan, Trans Am race, and at the end, and we had snow, we had rain, we even had a tragedy, and it was a terrible race. And at the end of the race, they gave the flag to Mark Donohue and said he won. And I went to Roger, I said, "But we didn't win. Parnelli won." And he goes, "Oh, let him figure it out." So now so somebody heard, somebody said, oh, something doesn't look right. So the officials are looking for me. By now, I'm in a closet inside the garage somewhere. And they said, oh, she's on the plane with Roger with the charts, So this is, again, BC. And it took the SCCA officials another 5, 6, 7 hours to go through all the numbers, which they have. They have all that to enact the 4-hour race. And at the end, they found it was Parnelli who had won the race. And I have a picture of Parnelli that Peter Luago had taken and in the media center, there's Parnelli getting his trophy, which is a couple of paper cups and a tennis ball or something. And I asked, to this day, I asked Chuck Cantwell, did we ever give them back the trophy? He goes, I don't know, it might be in my garage. Anyway, we're not talking about Sebring.
No, well, let's go back to the team here. We got 3 guys in the middle. When I read their curricula vitae, I said, well, I could introduce every one of them, but I'd be kind of repeating things. You all started out at a young age, and you started with Dick Barbour and Bob Garrettson, and you had all sorts of success. You pitted and service cars and built engines for Bob Aiken and Charles Mendez and the whole crew all the way down, and IndyCar, kart car. You went across the whole broad. But the thing that impressed me is you guys seem to follow each other. Jerry, how was that? You were the engine guy, right?
I was primarily the engine guy. I know Bill wanted to say, how did we get started in racing? Something like that. So I was, it was on?
Yeah.
Is it working? Yeah. So I was getting out of college without a direction, and I stumbled into a Volkswagen shop that had a race car, and then we started doing things like going to Pikes Peak. And when we went to Pikes Peak, I needed this guy to help us out on the car. There was an unknown guy. He'd been doing a lot of off-road racing in 1976. We won Pikes Peak. This particular guy's name was Rick Mears. Nobody had heard of him before that. And then we went on in 1977. We were running, and it was a Porsche shop. We had a 914-6. A customer brought to us and wanted to campaign in the GTU series. We won that series. We had 11 races. We won 8 of them. We got second, third, and fourth in the other 3. I was awarded Mechanic of the Year. So at the end of 1977, Bob Garrettson was the shop that I worked for, Garrettson Enterprises. Bob had known Dick Barbour from SCCA racing, and Dick had a 934 and a half he was campaigning, but he didn't really have a team. And so Bob and Dick joined forces, and we got Dick Barbour Racing going. And
Let me stop for a minute here. We got, there's Jerry Woods, Greg Elliff, and Martin Raffauf, all 3 part of that dynamic team that went for years. But you started so young. Was there ever a time you said, gosh, there's something better to do? I'm tired of the road travel.
So when we were campaigning the GTU car, there was, volunteers. Our team was primarily all volunteers. Martin was a volunteer. He worked for IBM. I was an employee at Garrettson Enterprises. Greg was an employee at Garrettson Enterprises, where we had Porsche Club volunteers that helped us at all races. And we brought him to Sebring, of course, in '78. But we were young, but we had a direction. And one of our engineers told me one time, he says, you guys, the one thing, he says, I work as an engineer for Lockheed. We might work on a project for a year and a half, and all of a sudden the bean counter say, done, throw it in the trash can. When our involvement with racing is we saw immediate returns on our time invested. We'd work in the shop, we'd work hard, we'd come to the racetrack. Sometimes we won. Well, we won quite a bit. And it was pretty fortunate that we had a pretty surrounded crew, dedicated people. Peter Gregg one time told us, he says, the reason you guys are winning is because all your volunteers, it's a love of the sport.
Yeah.
And that was really true with the Dick Barbour team,
Well, Well, Mark, you're kind of the historian of this thing. I tried to add up the wins that you had at Daytona, Le Mans, Sebring, and time ran out of me. You got them off the top of your head?
Myself, I've been fortunate to be on the winning team at Daytona 3 times, and here 7 times. Always been in the right place at the right time. This race we're discussing in '78 was my first race as a crew guy.
How old were you?
24.
Right.
I had been working for emcee as a tech inspector part-time, and I had told John Bishop, I'm not going to do this forever. I want to go work for a team. And early that week of Sebring, I talked to Dick because I knew him, and I said, this is what I'm thinking. Your shop, Garrettson, is like half a mile from my house in California. I'd like to come by at night and work and do whatever. And he says, oh, good. We have a lot of guys that do exactly that. And then he introduced me to Bob Garrettson, and Garrettson says, well, can you start now? I go, oh, yeah, okay. And part of my job was the first race. All the teams that hired Judy had to contribute somebody to go help her with her board for like an hour or whatever during the race. Yeah, and she was right. She wouldn't talk to anybody. She wouldn't even talk to the people who were helping her. She would pass down these little notes and say, here's the update, fix the board. But anyway, so then I get there and I start, moving tires, getting fuel, whatever. And I'm asking the crew guys, well, what's the prognosis for this race? And they all go, oh, well, Dick's car with the Rolf Stallman and Montford Shirty, that's a winning car. We're going to win. I said, well, what about this second car? And they all start laughing. They go, Bob Garrettson, that's his first race. He's only done autocrosses and SCCA stuff. And I said, well, what about this guy Mendez? He says, he's the race promoter. What does he know? And I said, well, we got Brian Redman. And they said, he's just out of the hospital. He doesn't even know if he can drive. So, of course, what happens, the number 1 car breaks, and this car drives around, has no problems, and wins. So, it's like Yogi Berra said, it ain't over till it's over.
It had to be the crew that made that happen. Right, Greg?
A little luck, a little perseverance, and not knowing that we couldn't win. And Brian is our statistician, and he'd learned from Ferrari, Porsche, GT40s. So
I got the list here. I'll go through it in a minute.
Whatever.
It's pretty long.
Jerry had done some endurance racing with Walt, but never 24-hour or 12-hour.
The first race that we went to that was more than an hour was a 3-hour race at Mid-Ohio. And a 3-hour race, oh my God. It's like the car kept going by and Walt took the lead. We were racing with Sam Posey in a Datsun, and Sam fell out. And so we were leading the race, and I kept going, slow down, slow down, slow down. At the end of the race, Walt came over and he wanted to slap me. He says, don't ever do that again. I'm going in slow. I've got a rhythm. And 3 hours took forever. And then at the end, kind of filling into this 1977, when we met up with Dick and we went to dinner at the finale for 1977, went out to dinner with Jim Busby talking about the future of, the 24-hour coming up in 1978. And Jim, I was just sitting there, I was a mechanic. What was I doing at this dinner? And Jim goes, I don't know how these mechanics go on for 24 hours. They got to be nuts. And I'm going, what? And then 12 hours, oh my God. And Sebring, of course, it was a brutal race. It was brutal from a lot of respects. If you go back, there were no lights. The pit lane was abominable.
The laminating runway from the 40s with chunks of concrete that were different levels.
But again, the secret to winning any race is you got to finish. And we had the expertise, especially Brian, who knew how to hold everything in control, And then, as an example, later in 1981, let's jump around a little bit, we went to at Daytona for the 24-hour. we happened to have Brian and a guy named Bobby Rahal and Bob Garrettson. About 4 hours in, we're leading the race. And Brian comes up and he says, what in the world is Bobby doing? He's going too fast. You know, Brian's trying to put the brakes on. We got 24 hours here. You know, he was always trying to, like Greg said, our experienced guy to hold us back, you know. It paid off.
I think the 935 wasn't finished, was it, when it arrived at Daytona?
No,
It was still being finished.
yeah, we qualified in 16.
Yeah, 15 for 16. And Bobby says to me, let me have a go, I can get it up there. I said, Bobby, leave it. So about 2 a.m, Bobby comes into the trailer and I say, how are we doing? He said, we're in the lead. I said, Bobby, I thought I told you. He said, I haven't passed a single car. They've all broken down.
Now, yes, when you look at this crew here, you're the best crew. I talked to Bobby Rahal about an hour ago. I said, look, you know, some of these guys I know, some I've known in passing, but tell me about how you thought about them. You worked with them. He said, 3 of the best of the best. And that comes from Bobby Rahal. Now, Brian Redman, when you think about his career, I saw Brian race, I think 1970 was Road Atlanta with Sid Taylor. That's 70 in the Formula 5000 car. So I have to go to my notes to read everything. You'll have to excuse this. But he drove he had 4 world championships of world sports car class for Ford in the GT40, Porsche, Ferrari, and Chevron. He drove in Formula One for Cooper, Williams, Surtees, McLaren, BRM, and Shadow. He drove in saloon cars in England early on. Also rolled his father's Jaguar, I guess, in one of your first races, right?
The saloon car was a 1959 Morris 1000 Woody.
Yeah, and what modifications did you do to that?
I put a Shorex supercharger on it, harder brake linings, an anti-tramp bracket on the back, and an anti-roll bar on the front, no roll cage, no fire extinguisher, no safety belts.
What about the windshield and the doors?
The second race, I thought it would improve the aerodynamics if I took the windshield out and the back doors off. So I arrived at this racetrack 100 miles from home, and the Scottish scrutineer looked at it. He said, very nice, laddie. He said, go away, put the seats back in, the windshield on, and the back doors on. I said, I can't. I said, they're 100 miles away. He said, we'll have a steward's meeting. So he came back and he said, you can race it one time only like this. So,
Did it work?
I have no idea.
In addition to saloon cars, Formula 2, Formula 1, World Endurance Championship, emcee, Formula 5000, where he ran the table 3 years in a row with Jim Hall in the Chaparral Lola, and you beat the likes of Mario Andretti and Jody Scheckter, both world champions. That must have been a challenge.
Well, the first year was 1973, and I actually won 5 races, and the champion, Jody Scheckter, won 4, because I missed 2 races. I was driving for Ferrari in Europe. But then 74, 5 and 6, we managed to win it with Mario finishing second for both years. And the third year, 76, Alonso was second. So,
Yeah, well then, tying that back to what we're doing this weekend, talking about the 78 race, you had just had a bad accident at Saint-Gervais. You went upside down, broke a bunch of bones. You were out of racing.
well, at that time, having won the 5,000 championships, I lived a great life living in the north of England in the Yorkshire Dales. Who's heard of James Herriot? Everybody? No? Yep. It's that sort of area. And we had a beautiful 18th century house with 2 acres of walled garden and a Porsche 917 in the garage and a 100-acre farm 5 miles away. So at the end of 76, they changed the rules because the promoters, the racetrack promoters, had bigger crowds for Can-Am, and Can-Am had finished in 1974. So the SCCA said, we're calling it Can-Am for 1977. You've got to put bodywork on. So I arrived in Saint-Gervais, Canada, for the first race of the new year, the beginning of June of 77. I've never seen the car before, but I know, prepared by Jim Hall and Chaparral,
and tested by Franz Weiss that it'll be okay. So out I go, it's very good. At this point, I'm 3 seconds faster than anyone. So I come in the pits and Jim Hall said, how is it? I said, it's good. And he said, what do you want to change the balance in the corners? I said, drop the front wing 1/4 of an inch. And on the next lap, at 170 miles an hour, it took off at the top of the hill, went about 30 feet in the air and came down upside down. And I broke my neck, C1, smashed the shoulder, split my breastbone, broke my ribs, the roll bar broke. I went down on the road and wore my helmet away. And I had a very severe concussion. And on the way to the hospital, they had me with a spare tire. So when my wife arrived the next morning from England, the headline in the Montreal papers, Redman anymore, Redman is dead. So it was a long recovery. But in about September of that year, I was walking and trying to run, and I rang Joe Hoppen, head of Volkswagen Porsche Audi competition. I said, can you find me a car for Sebring, not a competitive one, but a decent car? And I said, I just want to see if I can drive and if I want to drive. So as discussed, this with Charles and Bob Garrison, we go and win the bloody race. Well,
The guys have already said the expectations weren't real high for that race, but your strategy must have worked. Now, Charles, here you are with Bob Garrison, who hadn't raced in a long time and had not done any long distance important races like this. And you're just about 2 years into your career, and now you have Brian Redman. Tell me about how he worked it. Did he hog the car?
No, he didn't, not at all. But let me tell you how I got the ride to begin with. And I did. It wasn't from a call from the factory asking me to fill in for Bondurant, who was supposed to drive and became ill. But, when in promoting Sebring, we always did a press tour a couple of weeks before the race. And I'd called Dick Barbour. I said, Dick, can I have Brian for the press tour? And Dick said, well, can I come? And I said, of course. So the three of us set out. We'd done a few stops, and I think we were down in Miami, and Dick gets a call, and I hear him sounding somewhat disappointed and apologetic. And after he hung the phone up, I said, Dick, what's the matter? He said, well, that was Bob Bondurant. He can't do the race. He's ill. And I said, can I have that ride, Dick? And Dick looks at me and he says, do you know how to drive a 935? I said, sure. I'm figuring, Dick was promoting his 935s as twin turbos at the time. And I'm figuring a twin turbo 935 can't be much more challenging to drive than an RSR. Just 300 or 400 horsepower or more. And so Dick says, what do you think, Brian? I see him look at Brian, and I'm waiting for Brian to go, oh, no, no way. And Brian says, yeah, that's okay. So we made a deal. And when we got to the racetrack, of course, I didn't know any of these fellows here, and I saw the car. I said, Brian, this isn't a 935. He says, oh, don't worry about it. Don't worry about it. And I said, it's only got a single turbo. I said, and it's going through my head that the singles are much more challenging to drive than the twin. And they were. And so then I crawl into the car and I look at the axles, because those were two things that were giveaways, right? And the axles were the old style steel axles, that they weren't the titanium axles. And I thought, holy shit. So and Brian says, just relax. Don't worry about this. Everything is going to be just perfectly fine, And so I didn't protest to Dick. And I think the fact that I had an opportunity to drive this car. But what I stood up for me was, and you just never know stuff, right? The day before the race, Brian comes up to me, says, you're starting the race. And I said, Brian, we have Brian Redman in the car and I'm starting the race. He says, Dick said, you're starting the race, which was perfectly fine for me. I love to start the race. And so we took off. And if you were watching that video, there's David's Red Lobster car.
Greatest livery of a race car ever.
Yeah, the best. Anyway, so Brian says, we'll come in about 10 or 15 minutes and so we can see how things are. I don't know what he was going to see, how things were, you know. I thought things were perfectly fine. He says, you want to get out? I said, are you kidding me? No. And we just, we just continued to plod along and did pretty good, huh?
Derry, I got a question for you. Back in the days, I knew the Peter Gregg operation pretty good. When he ran Daytona, he would run a single turbo, and in others they'd run twin turbos. I know that the response time was different and the weight category was different. How did you decide which combination you were going to use?
We didn't have. Oh, we didn't have the twin turbo option in '78. The factory would always run 1 year ahead of us. So the factory twin turbo wasn't available to us until later on in the season. And so we were running the 934.5, and the beginning of the year, the 935 was a single turbo, and it had different suspension. The thing that made it different from the 934.5, besides the intake design on the engine, was the suspension. So Dick's car was a 935. Charles's car was in reality, here we go, a car that we made. At the end of 78, Bob Garrettson had rolled, or no, 70 was,
Oh, that was later.
yeah.
So
Than Gaia's car. At the end of '77, the last finale race, Johnny Rutherford was driving the Dick Barbour car with Dick. And there was a red flag. Johnny pulled over from his training with USAC. He pulled over and stopped. He pulled over and stopped. The son was in the following two cars coming up. There's Chris Cord in a Monza and Ted Fields in a 934.5. Johnny stopped. Chris Cord pulled over. Ted Fields went straight into the back of Rutherford, full tilt. Full tilt, boom. That car, our car was bent in the back, not too bad. The Ted Fields car was virtually totaled. So Dick bought the remains, or the Ted Fields car, and we took the guts out of that. We got a new tub from Porsche, and we built this car that won Sebring.
One of the funny stories on Rutherford is we were staying in the same motel next to Daytona Speedway, and I saw where he ripped the fender off the car, right? I couldn't see the other side, but I knew on the driver's side the fender was gone on the 935. And I said, Johnny, how you like driving sports cars? Because he hadn't done that very often. He says, well, it's great. I said, well, I see you lost a fender or two. He says, yeah, if they let me the next two fenders off, I'll show them how to really get around here. But that was Johnny. Greg, were you responsible for the whole chassis setup and everything on that car?
Porsche was a great supplier to customers. So they would give us a setup sheet for the whole book of setup sheets or sheets for each track that we'd run at. So early on, we were naive. They must know what they're doing. So we'd use their setup sheet and go to the track and start looking at tire temperatures. Goodyear was really good about giving us feedback. And Daytona has so much downforce because of the 31-degree banking that you have to run, normally you run negative camber. Everybody that does races kind of knows that. But in Daytona, the swing arm suspension has a lot of camber change. So you have to start with a degree and a half of positive camber on the right, or you overheat the tire, which didn't handle as well in the infield, but you had to put up with it, correct? But there was, so we pretty much used the stock setup. But later on, as we got more knowledgeable, and Brian taught me so many setup tricks and handling, and the setup we learned at Elkhart Lake, he taught me, oh, this is an oval track. I go, what? It goes right and left. No, this is an oval track to the right. And we start putting cross weight in the car like you would in a sprint car or midget. And we put a little stagger because the 935s had a spool. There was no differential in the back of the car. So you could drive around all the right-hand turns, and it made that. I still use it today when I go set a vintage car, and it can be 3-4 seconds a lap in a McLaren Can-Am car. And so Brian taught us a lot, and not just strategy and how to race cars, but setup, because he was with Jim Hall, he was with Ferrari, with the GT40 team, and the drivers of his day, himself, Mario, they were the engineering department. There was no computers. It was the driver's feel and how they like to drive and the tire temperatures.
Well, Porsche was kind of infamous, I think, for making customer cars all equal, because they couldn't favor one customer over the other. But I knew Jack Atkinson pretty well. As soon as they got a car, they took it apart and did their own thing to it. Yeah.
Yeah, this is part of that. Like the customer Porsche cars came usually a year later. Porsche would develop their own cars, and they would always have an advantage to the customer cars, but all the customers were treated pretty equally. And the other thing that Porsche always had available for us at the track was a parts truck. So, one of the things, we didn't have to inventory a lot of our own parts when we went to the races. And they always had technical knowledge at the track for us as well.
Now, Mark, you moved up the ranks, starting out as, 17 years old, right?
No, I started at emcee. I was, 20 in college, and then started as a crew guy at this race in 78.
What's with you in the toolbox?
Oh, the toolbox. Well, after this race, we take the cars back to Mountain View, California, and we're preparing them because the next race is in like 3 weeks at Talladega. And it's a thrash because there's only 3 weeks, and these cars had just run Sebring. And we're loading up, and they say, somebody's get on the lift gate there with this engine and this big old toolbox. Okay. We're going to raise the thing up and you stuff this thing in there. Okay. So somebody is going up, and then the chain breaks or something happens, and instead of going up and down, the lift gate starts going like this. Everything starts falling off. I grab the engine, the toolbox goes over the side, crashes into the parking lot, tools everywhere. And I'm like, oh my God, I've been here 2 weeks. I'm going to be fired already. Everybody runs out of the shop. Garrettson, Greg, what happened? What happened? The lift gate broke. The thing went over the side. And they all look and they go, good job, good job. And I'm like, what do you mean good job? Toolbox wrecked. Yeah, but you saved the engine. The more
I meant to do this early on, but please turn off your cell phone if you haven't already done so. Oh, one of these guys here?
I turned mine off.
Well, at this age, my ears hear everything, except what my wife tells me.
My other good memory of the race, during the race, of course, I was the young guy helping, didn't know anything. So I'm watching a lot, the pit stops, who's doing what. And I noticed there's this woman sitting in the back. She has a table, big chair. She's got a blackboard. She's like the pit manager. Her name was Marge Green. She ran the parts department at Garrettson with her husband, Tom. But she's got all the charts and keeping track of who's going to change what and who's doing what at the pit stops. About halfway through, she calls the guys over and says, brake pads need to be changed on this car. Next stop. And they're like, no, we looked at it. They're fine. They might go the distance. She's, no, I'm the pit manager. Change the brake pads. And there's a small argument and back and forth. And I'm like, ooh, this is, So the car comes in. I don't know, Charles maybe was driving, and they jack it up. They change the brake pad. Yeah, you, Greg and Jerry changed the pads. They give them to Bruce Anderson, who was like the co-owner of Garrettson's. And she jumps off her chair, runs over there. Give me that pad now. I'm gonna measure it. And Bruce says, okay. Picks it up with pliers, puts it on her hand. Of course, it's stuck to her hand. She's screaming. And the medics come take her away. Mental note to self: don't ask anybody to see the brake pads.
Charles, were you fortunate enough to have a radio on board in that year? Because that's kind of a transition year. Two-way communication.
In the Barbour car?
Doing the cards. Yeah. Wasn't shortly thereafter with the radio, though, wasn't it? 'Cause I think
I thought you had radios. Yeah.
you just
No, they
listened
didn't
to it,
work worth
that's
the
all.
shit, but I never had one that worked worth the shit anyway.
Yeah, it's amazing if you look around Sebring, like yesterday, I was watching them set up the pits out at the paddock area. And there, look at, when you walk down through there, you don't even have to go in, you can see from out here. These antennas are like 70 or 80 feet in the air, you know, and we didn't have radios that could reach all the way around the track. If we were lucky if they worked in the pit box, you know. And the modern equipment out here, it's a whole other world, I mean, modern equipment, we have flush toilets in the bathrooms here. 1978, it was lucky if we had an outhouse, you know.
So I wanted to add something going back to timing and scoring, and I know that the numbers and the information I provided was a good strategy for the teams during 12 hours.
Invaluable.
However, I don't know if it was one of you who said this to me, who looked at me and said, brain powers. When you really need them, you really need them. So in a short race, short timing and scoring is only valuable up to a point that people know what's going on. But when you really need that information, you really need that. Like brain powers. Wasn't one of you who said that, was it? Somebody.
Which one of you was on the radio to him?
And we didn't want to get you angry at us. We were having, no, you were just so focused. You didn't, yeah. Anyway, you were talking about setup, and this was only our second race, so we weren't doing tweaking or setups or and Daytona, we'd done really well. We finished second overall against all these world European teams. Yost, Kramer was probably there, Porsche, and Sebring. We ran a second car, and Bob goes, "You're going to be crew chief on the second car." I go, "Okay." You know, I wasn't crew chief on the first car. And so it was ironic the whole weekend that Brian was learning to drive again, and he confided in me, and any driver that's had a closed head injury will tell you he's perfect. But Brian would confide in you, I don't know if I'm going to be able to drive. We'll see how it goes. About the third practice session, we were slow. The third practice session, he comes on to the last turn of the pit straight and starts walking the cars sideways, and comes in smiling. I go, "Coming back? Yeah, it'll be okay."
So Greg didn't mention much in the 1981, the Daytona race that we won with. Well, you know, Greg's he's a pretty big guy now, but I think you were bigger then, weren't you? You were a big heavyweight, rather slow moving, slow talking. Well, and somewhere around the middle of the night, an exhaust header broke.
Practice.
Well, he flies under the back of the 935 and he's shouting for parts and wrenches and changed this red hot header in something like 15 minutes or so. Or was it 13?
12, I think.
It's pretty amazing.
But who's counting, right?
Well, a little lead up to one of the successes for the 78 year with the 935 with this car. At the 77 meeting with Jim Busby, they were talking about the turbochargers were ball bearing turbochargers, and you'd have to plan in a 12-hour or a 24-hour race to change turbochargers. And I'm thinking to myself, that's nuts. A red hot turbocharger, we're going to change it in the race? No. So Bob Garrison's older brother worked for a company in Southern California, Garrett Air Research, and they've been building turbos. We got the 77 car bracket, brought it home, tore it all apart to get ready for the 24-hour. I took the turbocharger. I'd been rebuilding turbochargers. Ball bearings, sure enough, they're blue. you know. Well, we can't run these. I'm not going to plan on it. So Fred Garrison had an engineer at Garrett Research develop or redo the turbochargers, which was what we call a plain bearing. It wasn't a ball bearing. Because Fred Burdett, the engineer, says, you know, last time we used ball bearings in a turbocharger was pre-World War II. You know, why in the world? So we re-engineered the turbos. We got one to quote unquote test for the 24-hour in 1978. I got it on a Thursday afternoon. We put it in the car. Oh, this is great. I'm not going to have to change it during the race. We went out for a test and we had a misfire. And all the factory support people, they come over, they take the intake, air intake that go into the turbo, and they wiggle the turbo. Well, ball bearing turbo doesn't wiggle, doesn't have any radial play. But a plain bearing has radial play. Well, now it has radial play. So they all look at me and they go, the turbocharger's bad. You have to put a new turbo. It's got too much play. So here I am. How do I explain to these Germans that we've re-engineered their turbocharger? Dude, Brian can just imagine what the thought process is.
They don't take that well.
So I was really fortunate. My German wasn't very good at the time. Well, I speak German now.
It was probably good that your German wasn't very good.
So, but Vossik Polak was standing there. Vossik, and I explained to him what we'd done with the turbo, and his shop was in Hermosa Beach down in Southern California. He knew Garrett Air Research, so he turns around and tells all the Germans what we'd done. They just stood up and walked away. They just walked away. And you're on your own. So, fortunately, our other good friend in racing, Wolfgang Husted, was the Bosch representative. And Wolfie walks over to me and he gives me 12 brand new spark plugs. He says, put these in, that'll solve your problem. So we put them in, solved the problem, the misfire went away. But it wasn't a turbocharger afterwards. We ran the race, finished second overall, and the turbo didn't need to be changed. We conquered the world. Oh. We come to Sebring. We got more of these turbochargers prepared. We come to Sebring here. The number one car that had Rolf Stallman, Monfort and Dick Barbour, and this car here, all had the new turbocharger, the modified turbocharger. On the pace lap, the one that was on Rolf Stallman's car, the quote-unquote number one team car, broke on the pace lap.
That was on the pole as well.
So we had to come in, change the turbocharger. Oh my God. And so it fell back. That number one car fell back quite a ways. And about 2 or 3 hours later, a shock absorber broke and put a hole in the oil line. But again, so the turbocharger that was on Charles and Brian Bob's car was perfect. Didn't change it at all during the 12-hour race.
Charles, when did you recognize Charles, when did you recognize that you were going to win this thing?
Oh, after I got out of the car in the first hour.
That's optimistic.
They were only, in the first hour of that race, if I remember somewhat correctly, Peter Gregg went out. David Hobbs went out, which we all expected that. Not because of David, but that little BMW seemed to be a bit fragile.
That was a sprint race car.
Oh yeah, he was very quick. So I didn't know. I didn't think about winning the race. I just thought about make sure you don't do anything crazy with this car because these guys will kill you. And they were a lot bigger than I was. Bill, there's David Howard. Hey.
We were just talking about your 320i.
Okay, that'll cost you $100 now. No, I think about midway through the race, everybody was out except Hurley, and Hurley was still running very, very hard. And I think they blew a turbo. I think they had problems with the wheel, so that allowed us to stay on our strategy, and it all worked out well.
Well, we just saw David, my old friend David, who was after a terrible accident at Canada in 1977. He was the only one that came to visit, to I think it was more to keep my wife company than it was to see how I was doing. So, as you know, he drove for BMW for years, really. I didn't do that many races, but we won Daytona and Sebring, the two most important ones. So David said to me a couple of years ago, he says, I can't understand why you're always invited, to these BMW club meetings, and I'm not. I said, well, you never won any races.
A story on Brian Redman. I had an indiscretion here at Sebring in a club race. Ended up 8 days in a intensive care. And I woke up one day, I'm laying in the bed with hoses in my arms and in my nose. I look up and there's Brian Redman at the end of the bed. And he looked at me and says, well, you've done it now, lad.
I'm going to put an ad for Brian's book. If you haven't got it, buy it. It's the most real story about the era of racing in those days. There's no holds barred on how dangerous it was. Tribute to you, Brian. Great book.
Well, it was done 9 years ago, 2016. And the publisher in England, they did a great promo job on it in England. And I went over for 3 nights of successive promotional work. The first was at the Porsche store near Harrods. And there, they probably, 100 books were sold. It was good. The next night was at Brooklands, a famous, very old racetrack in England, a bank circuit from the early 1900s. And that was pretty good as well. And then the third night was at the Royal Automobile Club, the premier sort of thing. It is magnificent Pall Mall building and everything. They've got like 120 people for dinner. And to come to dinner, you had to buy the book. So they're all there. The very good commander who introduced me and said, and now I'd like to introduce you to Brian Redman, the most famous driver you've never heard of.
Charles, who was assigned most of the night driving? Was that split up?
Say again, Bill?
Who did most of the night driving? And how'd you determine who was going to drive the night station?
I think
This place was pretty dark at night back then.
Oh, I loved it at night.
Did you?
This was
You couldn't see what could hurt you.
This was the part of Sebring that I fell in love with the first time I came here. And I always enjoyed doing that. I drove almost as well at night as I did in the daytime, because I didn't see worth the shit, so it didn't make a difference. But I think we split it up pretty good. I think Dick put Bob in the car for the last half hour because he wanted him to finish the race, for whatever their deal was. Okay.
I was thinking about this team and what you accomplished in that time. And I think what stands out most, not only your success, but the fact that you and Dave Cowart saved Sebring for what it is today.
Yeah.
You stepped in, 5 years? And
Right.
you've turned it around, and now we have it. Congratulations.
Yeah, if I could tell a couple of little stories about being the promoter, because
Have at it.
when we're all racing cars and everything, we just assume that this stuff happens automatically. And when Greenwood left, we found that there was no history of the operation of the race. There was certainly plenty of history on the racing side. And what David and I set out to do was we wanted to reestablish the tradition here, community involvement. We had to re-engage with sponsors, media, bring all this stuff back together because it was in pretty rough shape. And I think we accomplished that. But one story that I always enjoyed thinking about was I met with Larry Woods. I got Larry, to commit to re-sponsor the race. It was $1,000 for the vintage cars. And one day I met Larry in New York, and he said, by the way, he says, I've invited Victor Pruch to come to dinner with us. And Victor's the executive VP at Whitco Chemical, which owned Kendall Oil. And I said, that's great. And Victor was a pretty high-powered individual. And we had a great time at dinner. We got along real well. And Victor looks at me and says, so what can we do for you? And, you had to be opportunistic back then to get rides, to get money. And I told Victor, I said, I need 16,000 gallons of gasoline. And he says, he laughs, he says, we don't make gasoline. I said, I know you know people that make gasoline. Anyway, he looks at me, he says, we got a deal. So about 3 weeks later, Larry calls me and says, Charles, you need to come to Bradford, Pennsylvania. He says, fly up to Buffalo. We'll meet you there. We'll drive you down, blah, blah, blah. And I couldn't figure out what that was. So I fly in, I meet Larry and his boss. We get in the car, and it's kind of a cold, snowy like night. And we're driving down, and these guys did not say a word to me for about an hour. They're in the front seat, and they're kind of not talking too much. And I said, Larry, what's going on? He says, well, he said, we got in a lot of trouble for Victor making that deal with you. He said, the president of Kendall's soon-to-be son-in-law has promised him that he could get anything he wanted at Sebring for $1,000. And I said, Larry, that deal is over, man. Not anymore. He says, well, we got to bring this thing together because the president was really angry at them. So I said, don't worry, we'll make something happen. So that night I went to my motel room and I was making notes and making notes and making notes. And we went in there. He had this stern look in his face, and Larry is here, and his boss is here, and they are literally sweating. And I started talking to Ray Saunders, who was president of Kendall at the time. And I went through my list and all the stuff they were going to get, and he was like, at the end of the meeting, he said, "Well, that sounds pretty good, Larry. That's a pretty good deal, don't you think?" And I was like, they were like, anyway, it's like that's the kind of stuff you had to deal with back then. There wasn't a $1 million of this and $1 million of that. You had to kind of get people to buy into the vision that we had recreated here. So there was a lot more work after that. The last year we were here, the sheriff was going to beat my ass one day before the race because I told him he was threatening to shut the race down. And I said, if you do that, you're going to start a riot. And he jumped up and put his chest right here. He says, I'm going to kick your ass if you don't shut your mouth.
Was that the worst challenge you had in the 5 years?
It was. No, not exactly.
Well, you must have got on their good side because when we were there, the last half hour of the race, we started seeing all these state troopers coming across the track and lining up and hooking arms. And we go, what the heck is going on? And they had rushed the pits the year before, like the two folks that do in Formula One races. And I guess they'd taken tools and team gear, and I never seen so many. I mean, it was the whole front pit straight. And we go, well, let's get out of here.
Well, that's because the fans from the Green Park were coming, and you didn't know if they were going to kill you, step on you, or steal your tools.
How many people here are here for Sebring for the first time? All right, that's impressive. How many were here in '78? How many were here in the 60s? Hey, we were just kids. I was here in 1960. You didn't call. When were you here, David? David?
1950.
Oh, boy.
I
Wow.
was here in 50.
That's impressive. Well, we got some time here for some questions. I know these guys have all the answers. If not, they'll make them up. Anybody got any questions? Come on. Somebody's got to have a question.
Funny story about racing
I think we had some a little earlier, but we can try again.
About what?
I got one for Daytona. So 81, Brian's driving with Bob Garrettson. I think you drove like 4 a.m. to 6 a.m. And then he comes in, gets out. Bob goes out. And he says, where's breakfast? We're like, don't know. We haven't organized anything. And he says, I'll take care of it. And marches off in his driving suit. And we're all looking at each other and go, what is he going to get? Where's he going to get breakfast? What does he know about the food? And then like 30 minutes later, he comes back with bags of all this McDonald's stuff. He had driven across the track to the McDonald's, He walks in his suit and they look and they say, "You're leading the race. What are you doing here?" Just my guy's got to eat. I got to get the food.
1980 at Le Mans, we had a brand new Kramer K3 delivered to Le Mans. Well, it was with John Fitzpatrick and Dick Barbour, and I think John put it on pole position, didn't he? Well, the next day, we're no longer on pole position. They changed the rules. So instead of the fastest lap, it was the average of the three drivers. And that put us in second place and a French car in first place. Then we're
What
there.
year was that? What year?
And Dick was a bit off the pace initially, and in the end, towards the end of qualifying, Dick comes in and he's pretty heavyweight. He heaves himself out of the car, he's sweating. He says, "How did I do, Bri?" I said, "Dick, you're on the pace." He said, "Yeah, I knew I could do it." And I went, for the boost. And he goes, "Brian, I swear before God, I did not touch the boost." And about 4 a.m, it went on to 5 cylinders. You remember that? I was ready to go home, but anyway, when the drivers take over, you usually stay in the pits just to see that everything's okay. And I'm cold and wet. And Dick goes out, he comes in at the end of his first lap. And through the rain, I see his hand waving. And I run round to the car, and Dick looks out the door. He says, "Brian," he says, "you guys are paid to drive in conditions like this. Get back in." We finished 5th overall and first in the emcee class, but we actually had a good chance of winning first overall till we
12 hours we were in the lead.
Judy, you got a story.
One of the endearing things about Sebring is the fires during the race and burning tires and old cars and RVs, whatever they're burning out there. So I'm timing and scoring up on top. I was able to get one of those open areas back then in the 70s and 80s. And by the end of the 12-hour race, when you take your glasses off, your entire face is black from the tire smoke. And even the tire smoke was sort of making a haze where it was getting hard to see the cars. That was, and I understand, I asked today, do they still allow them to do that? And apparently they do. They
I
don't?
don't think they do.
Oh, I thought
think-
they let them.
I think they don't allow the campfires. They allow some grills, but not campfires.
Can you burn tires on a grill?
But if you can fit it on the grill, you can burn it.
I'm gonna.
I got one more. I do have a funny Sebring story. 1986, I'm here. I'm working on the Code 962 at Aiken. The co-drivers are Stuke and Gardner, and we're in practice. And Stuke is a jokester. The guy's 73 going on 12 still, and he's always joking with every other driver and playing tricks and doing this stuff. So we finished the first day of practice, and he goes, Joe, I don't feel good. I'm going back to the hotel. I have to get some medicine. Joe says, okay, I'll take care of the next test or whatever. Stuke leaves. And he tells us later, he comes back in like an hour and a half. He says, I went to the hotel. I got the keys from the manager to Joe's room. I went into the room. I put everything out in the parking lot. The bed, the chairs, his clothes on the rack, everything. And he comes back and he's like, oh. And then he says, Joe, you done? Let's go get something to eat. Okay. So they drive back. He's driving back to the hotel and they pull in. And Joe Gardner says, what is all this shit in the parking lot? Hey, that's my shit. Stuke by then is rolling on the floor.
One last Sebring story, okay?
How about here at Sebring when we used to have hitchhikers out on the track? Yeah, I mean, the drivers would radio in and they'd say, like with Dwayne Baker in '83, it happened other times.
Our pit marks over here.
Yeah. There's our drivers radio in, there's a guy out on the track hitchhiking. They put the yellow flag out, pace cars going along, looking for this guy, he disappeared. And, okay, they went back raining and, a couple hours, he came back out again, the drunks from the Green Park.
They were all over.
Nobody covers for the Green Park anymore, you know. They're on their own.
My favorite Sebring story was I was working for Road and Track, and Al Holbert and Michael Kaiser were winning the race. This was 76, I think, in the Penthouse magazine Porsche. Well, I was up in the press box with John Smiley, who was the press officer, and the Penthouse Pet of the Year was there. And John said to me, he said, "Do you have to go to victory lane?" I said, "Yeah, I'm shooting for Road and Track. I'll take her down there." So yeah, take her down. She's wearing a green jumpsuit, unbuttoned below her navel with a gold chain wrapped around her waist. So I said, "Come on, we'll go on down." We go down. It's pitch black. We get to the back of the Jaguar Tower, and this geriatric turns on his flashlight. Says, "Pardon me, miss, can I see your pass?" She goes, "Well, these do." and gentlemen, I'm holding the gate going, I didn't say anything. So, yeah, old guy, yes. In fact, she's up on the stand with Al and Michael, and I kept yelling, "Can I see your pass, miss?" And she said, "Page 74. I had to go buy the magazine.
One more story? Why not, right?
Well, the one I want to thank Charles, and especially this ARCF organization. That I truly believe of all the tracks that we've participated in, I've lived in Germany for a couple of years. Sebring has so much history. I mean, Le Mans has history, you know, Daytona, but Sebring has just incredible history, and I think we all have to remember that and try and restore it, you know. And so, keeping the organization going. Thank you, Charles.
Here, here.
Stand up for
And Ford Heacock. And Ford Heacock.
Ford's doing the work. No one overlooked the Sebring royalty that we have in the house. The Ritchie Smith family is here with Doug, his son.
Yep.
And all of the Smith family, please stand up. Ritchie was down at Goldman's right arm. He was the race secretary and the administrator for the race. So, guys, thank you so much for making the trip. Take care. They've been to the race too many times, right?
I miss the fragrance of the orange blossoms. I remember the first year I came here, I could even smell it on the airplane, even though it landed in Tampa. I could smell the orange blossoms, and that was, someone told me that there's a orange issue.
Orange blossoms and castor bean oil.
Oh, they go together so well.
The orange blossoms have moved out because of all the people that have moved in.
Okay, I now go to my next assignment with BMW.
All right, we're going to wrap it up. I have one more story. I got to tell one more story. In '79, I had my own car, and Brian was driving with me here. And on the, we qualified fourth or fifth, which we typically would. But on the first lap of the race, I don't know how many of you all are familiar with the old track, because we've been talking about the old track, but it was 2 high-speed sweepers, and then you had to narrow it down into turn 3 to go in the infield. Well, going into turn 3, the brakes just went out totally in the car on the first lap, and I fortunately, as the promoter of the race, I knew the layout of the facility, so I cut back and went across the back, got on the track, came back around, and just as I was approaching the entrance or pit entrance, I remembered that timing and scoring was right there, and I thought, if I show up there ahead of the field, they're going to know something went wrong, because there was no way I was going to be at the head of the field. So I slowed down, let them all in. We fell to last place, ran there and it took us about 5 hours to get back in the top 10. And then we were trading spots with, I don't know who was in. It was Bob Aiken's, Dick Barbour's Bob Aiken's car. And we would easily have beaten them, but our fuel guy went to the wet t-shirt contest. And on the way back, he got caught in traffic. We ran out of fuel and fortunately ran out at pit entrance, and got it back on the track, got going again. We were about 4 laps down from them. And in the night, Brian was a little hotter on the car. I think he used more boost than the rest of us, right, Brian? Never touched the boost. That thing glowed. Those turbos. There were 2 turbos in the car at that point, but they glowed so bright. I mean, you could see them anywhere. Anyway, he tried to chase them down. We got down to about a lap, but we couldn't quite get back to first.
Well,
Okay,
Ford-
one final
Ford-
Sebring story. My third race with John Wire Gulf Racing, the GT40 Ford. Jack Hicks had won the Kyle Army 9 hours in November 67. That's when I signed a contract with John Wire. So with Daytona, the second gear broke in the horseshoe. And I got a glimpse of John Wire's famous face, like they got death ray. Because in the night it's cold and windy, and there's John Wire in a scarf, gloves, and a cap. His wife, Totty, is doing the timing. She's covered in a coat and everything. Well, after we'd broken down, another English driver, Edward Nelson, driving a Ford GT40, came up to John and shook his trouser leg. And John said, yes. He said, John, can we borrow your gearbox parts? Our gearbox linkage is having trouble. He said, no, go away. So about 20 minutes later, he comes back and he shakes John's trouser leg again. And this time I saw the first example of the death ray. Because quivering with rage, John Wire stares down at Edward Nelson like this, and then he shouts, get out of the way, you fucking idiot. So at Sebring, now it's my third race. Well, I tried to outbrake Joe Sippert in a factory Porsche coming into this last turn. And my thinking was, if I screw up and spin, there's plenty of room, Anyway, I did screw up and spun. So now I'm whistling backwards. Well, whilst I'm going backwards with the wheels locked and spinning, I put it into first gear. And then I thought it had stopped. And I give it a rev and dropped the clutch. The clutch exploded immediately. So that was it. So I didn't get the death ray. But John did say to me, Redman, I'd like you to write out 100 times. When going backwards, please don't try to go forwards. So that was that.
Well, it's been a great program. And I want to thank Ford for putting this together. It's been a great time, great memories. Be back next year. So thank you all.